I'm Samantha Mitchell, 26 years old, and I should have been the happiest woman alive standing at that altar in my white dress. Instead, I was staring down an empty aisle where my father should have been walking beside me. Just 3 days earlier, he had looked me straight in the eye and said those words that shattered my heart, $10,000, Sam. That's what it'll cost for me to walk you down the aisle. But what happened next proved that blood doesn't always make family, and sometimes the most powerful bonds are forged in the fires of betrayal. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable true stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss what these 50 Marines did when they found out how my father tried to extort money from his own daughter's wedding. Let's get into this wild ride together. Growing up, I thought I had a normal family. Sure, we weren't perfect, but whose family is? My mother Linda was the glue that held everything together until cancer took her from us when I was just 16 years old. After Mom's funeral, my father Robert became a different man entirely. The warmth disappeared from his eyes, replaced by something cold and calculating that I didn't recognize. He threw himself into work, leaving me to navigate my teenage years mostly alone. When I graduated high school, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. I enlisted in the Marine Corps, partly to serve my country, but mostly to escape the suffocating emptiness that had settled over our house like a thick fog. The Corps saved me in ways I never expected. It gave me purpose, discipline, and most importantly, it's where I met Jake Thompson. Jake was everything my father wasn't: kind, supportive, and genuinely interested in my dreams and ambitions. We served together for 3 years before we both transitioned to civilian life, and by then, we knew we wanted to spend the rest of our lives together. When Jake proposed last spring in the same park where we had our first date, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Planning our wedding became this beautiful distraction from all the pain I'd carried since losing Mom. I wanted everything to be perfect, a celebration of the love and family that Jake and I were building together. About 2 years ago, Dad surprised everyone by marrying Brenda, a woman he'd met at some work conference. I tried to be happy for him, really I did. Brenda seemed nice enough at first, though something about her smile never quite reached her eyes. She brought her 24-year-old son Kevin into our family, and suddenly our quiet house was full of new voices and new dynamics. I thought maybe this was exactly what Dad needed to heal from Mom's loss. I was so wrong about everything. The bomb dropped on a Tuesday evening in October when Jake and I went to Dad's house for our regular family dinner. We'd been excitedly sharing our wedding plans, talking about the venue we'd chosen and how beautiful the ceremony was going to be. I mentioned how much it would mean to me to have Dad walk me down the aisle, how I'd been dreaming of that moment since I was a little girl watching Disney movies with Mom. The silence that followed my words stretched on so long that I actually wondered if I'd said something offensive. Dad set down his fork, looked directly at me with those cold eyes, and said, "Well, Sam, that's going to cost you $10,000. At first, I thought he was joking. I actually laughed and waited for the punchline. But Dad's expression didn't change. Brenda nodded approvingly beside him, and Kevin smirked like he was watching some entertaining television show. "I'm serious," Dad continued, his voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "After everything I've invested in raising you, the least you can do is compensate me for my time and effort. $10,000, and I'll walk you down that aisle. Otherwise, you can find someone else to do the job." Jake's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently, but I could see the anger flashing in his eyes. "Mr. Mitchell," Jake said carefully, "surely you don't mean that. Sam is your daughter. Walking her down the aisle isn't a job, it's an honor." Dad laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Honor doesn't pay bills, son. I've got a new wife and stepson to think about now. Sam's been on her own for years, making her own decisions, living her own life. If she wants me to play father of the bride, then she needs to pay for the performance." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt 16 again, standing beside Mom's hospital bed, watching her slip away while Dad stood in the corner checking his phone. The man sitting across from me wasn't my father anymore. He was a stranger wearing my father's face, demanding payment for what should have been an act of love. Brenda reached over and patted Dad's hand supportively. "Robert's absolutely right, dear," she said in that syrupy sweet voice that I was beginning to hate. "Family is all about give and take, and you've certainly done your share of taking over the years." That night, Jake held me while I cried in our apartment, trying to process what had just happened. "We don't need him," Jake kept saying, stroking my hair. "We'll have a beautiful wedding without him." But he didn't understand. It wasn't about needing Dad there. It was about the fact that the man who was supposed to love me unconditionally had just put a price tag on his affection. The little girl inside me who still remembered being Daddy's princess was screaming in agony, and I didn't know how to make it stop. If I thought that dinner was the worst of it, I was incredibly naive. Dad wasn't content to just make his demand and wait for my response. Over the next few weeks, he launched what I can only describe as a calculated campaign to wear down my resistance. He started small, calling me almost daily to remind me about his generous offer. Each conversation followed the same pattern. He'd start by acting like a concerned father asking about wedding plans, then gradually work his way around to the money. "You know, Sam," he'd say during these calls, "10,000 really isn't that much when you think about it. You and Jake both have good jobs. You can afford it. It's just a matter of whether you think your old dad is worth it." The manipulation was so blatant it made me sick, but somehow it still worked. Each call left me feeling more guilty and more confused about what the right thing to do was. Then Brenda got involved, and things got exponentially worse. She started showing up at my apartment unannounced, usually when Jake was at work. She'd invite herself in for coffee and then spend the next hour playing the concerned stepmother role to perfection. "I'm so worried about your father," she'd say, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that never seemed to actually have tears on it. "This whole situation is tearing him apart inside. He loves you so much, but he feels like you don't respect him anymore. Family unity is so important, Sam. Surely you can see that." The worst part was that Kevin, my stepbrother, completely bought into his mother's act. He started sending me long text messages about how selfish I was being, how I was causing unnecessary drama in the family over something as simple as money. "Mom and Dad have been so good to you over the years," one message read. "The least you could do is show some gratitude. $10,000 is nothing compared to what they've invested in you emotionally." But it was during one of these unexpected coffee visits that Brenda let slip something that made my blood run cold. She was in the middle of another tearful performance about family harmony when she casually mentioned how much it had cost Dad to set up your college fund and everything. I stared at her, confused, because I knew for a fact that Mom had set up my college fund before she died. It was one of the last things she'd done, making sure I'd have money for education no matter what happened to her. "What do you mean Dad set up my college fund?" I asked carefully. Brenda's face went pale, and I could see her realizing she'd said something she shouldn't have. "Oh, well, you know, he managed it after your mother passed," she backtracked quickly. But I was already reaching for my laptop, pulling up the bank account information that I hadn't checked in months. What I found there made me physically nauseous. The college fund that should have had nearly $25,000 in it was almost completely empty. There were systematic withdrawals going back 2 years, right around the time Dad married Brenda. Money that my dying mother had scraped together to ensure my future had been slowly drained away to fund Dad's new life with his new family. When I confronted him about it that evening, he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "That money was sitting there doing nothing," he said with a shrug. "Brenda and Kevin needed things, and you were already out of college anyway. It's not like you were going to use it." The casual way he dismissed my mother's final gift to me was the moment I truly understood who Robert Mitchell really was underneath the father facade. Jake had to physically restrain me from saying things I would have regretted later. But Dad wasn't finished. When yelling didn't work, when guilt didn't work, when theft apparently wasn't enough, he decided to turn the rest of our extended family against me. He called my aunts and uncles, my cousins, even family friends, spinning this elaborate tale about how I'd become ungrateful and disrespectful since joining the military. According to his version of events, I was refusing to pay him back for all the money he'd spent raising me, and I was planning to exclude him from my wedding over petty disagreements. The phone calls from relatives started almost immediately. People who had known me my entire life were suddenly lecturing me about respecting my elders and honoring my family. Most of them bought Dad's story completely, never thinking to ask for my side of what was happening. The few who did listen to my explanation seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation and stopped calling altogether. Within a month, I went from having a large, supportive extended family to feeling completely isolated and alone. The final straw came when Dad contacted our wedding venue directly. He'd kept a copy of my emergency contact information from years ago, back when he actually acted like a father. He called the venue coordinator, claiming there was a family emergency and that the wedding needed to be canceled immediately. Thank God the coordinator was smart enough to call me before actually canceling anything, but the whole incident left me shaking with rage and fear. Dad wasn't just trying to extort money from me anymore. He was actively trying to destroy my wedding entirely. That night, I sat in our apartment surrounded by wedding planning materials, feeling more alone than I had since Mom died. The man who was supposed to protect me was attacking me instead, using every weapon in his arsenal to hurt me as deeply as possible. Jake found me there hours later, still in the same position, staring at nothing. "I think I want to call off the wedding," I whispered, and the words tasted like defeat in my mouth. What I didn't realize was that Dad's cruelty had only just begun. Apparently, my refusal to pay his ransom had triggered something darker in him, something that went far beyond simple greed. Over the next few weeks, he escalated his campaign against me in ways that I never could have imagined. It was like he declared war on my entire life, and he was determined to win at any cost. The first sign that things were getting worse came when my boss at the marketing firm where I worked pulled me aside for what she called a concerning conversation. Apparently, Dad had called the office multiple times, claiming to be worried about my mental state. He'd told elaborate stories about my erratic behavior and anger management issues that he attributed to my military service. He even suggested that the stress of wedding planning was causing me to have some kind of breakdown. "I know this is probably nothing," my boss said carefully, "but your father sounded genuinely worried about you. He mentioned some incidents at home that made him concerned about your stability. I just wanted to check in and make sure everything was okay." The humiliation of having to explain that my father was lying about me to my employer was almost unbearable. Thankfully, my boss knew my work well enough to not take Dad's claims seriously, but the fact that he'd tried to sabotage my career was a new level of betrayal. The rumors he was spreading in our hometown were even worse. Dad had lived there his entire life and knew everyone worth knowing. He spent his evenings at the local bar, telling anyone who would listen about his troubled daughter who had come back from the military changed and disrespectful. He painted himself as a long-suffering father dealing with a child who had been damaged by war, conveniently leaving out the fact that I'd never been deployed to a combat zone. People I'd known since childhood started looking at me differently when I went to town. Former teachers who used to hug me when they saw me now gave me polite nods and hurried away. The narrative Dad was spinning made him the victim and me the villain, and I had no way to fight back without looking exactly like the unstable person he was claiming I was. It was a perfect trap, and he knew it. But the real gut punch came from someone I'd trusted completely. Aunt Margaret, Dad's sister, had been like a second mother to me after Mom died. She was the one person in Dad's family who had always taken my side, who had always made me feel loved and supported. When she called asking to meet for lunch, I thought maybe she was going to be my ally in this mess. I couldn't have been more wrong. "Sam, honey," she said gently, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "I need you to know that I've been talking to your father about all this wedding business." My heart sank immediately. He's told me everything that's been happening, and I have to say, I'm disappointed in you. Robert raised you as a single father after your mother died, and asking for a little financial recognition for walking you down the aisle doesn't seem unreasonable to me. The betrayal hit me like a truck. Margaret wasn't just taking Dad's side, she was actively helping him. As our lunch continued, it became clear that she'd been reporting back to him about every conversation we'd had over the past few months. She knew about my wedding dress shopping, my honeymoon plans, even my private fears about starting married life. Everything I'd shared with her in confidence had been passed along to Dad like intelligence reports. "He's your father, Sam," Margaret continued, completely oblivious to how much she was hurting me. "Family should come first, before anyone else. Even before Jake. A good daughter would find a way to make this work." The fact that she genuinely believed what she was saying made it even worse. This wasn't malicious betrayal, this was family choosing sides, and I was losing. While all this was happening, Dad had also launched a systematic campaign against our wedding vendors. He called our florist claiming that I'd been unreliable with previous vendors and that they should require full payment up front. He contacted our photographer with a rambling story about family drama and suggested they might want to reconsider working our wedding. He even called our caterer to warn them that there might be issues with payment. Most of the vendors were professional enough to call me directly about these strange conversations, but the stress of constantly having to explain and reassure them was exhausting. Every day brought a new crisis, a new fire to put out, a new way that Dad was trying to sabotage the most important day of my life. I started having anxiety attacks, waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, wondering what fresh hell would be waiting for me in the morning. The breaking point came when Dad showed up at our apartment drunk one evening, pounding on the door and shouting about the money I owed him. Jake answered the door, trying to be diplomatic, but Dad pushed past him into our living room, swaying on his feet and reeking of alcohol. "Where's my ungrateful daughter?" he slurred, looking around wildly. "Time to pay up, Sam. $10,000, or I'll make sure your precious wedding never happens." When I appeared from the kitchen, Dad's expression turned ugly. "There she is," he said, pointing an unsteady finger at me. "Miss High and Mighty Marine, too good to take care of the father who raised her. You think you're so tough in your little military uniform, but you're still just a selfish little girl who doesn't know what real sacrifice looks like." The verbal abuse was bad enough, but when Dad started moving toward me with his fists clenched, Jake stepped between us. "Mr. Mitchell, you need to leave. Now." Dad took a swing at Jake, missing wildly but making his intentions clear. Jake could have easily overpowered him, but instead, he just held Dad's arms gently until the fight went out of him. Neighbors had heard the shouting and called the police, who arrived just as Dad was stumbling back to his car. The officers were kind but firm, explaining to Dad that he couldn't come to our apartment anymore and that any further harassment would result in formal charges. As they escorted him away, Dad turned back to shout one final threat, "You'll pay for this, Sam. I'll sue you for emotional damages. I'll take everything you have." The neighbors all came out to watch the spectacle, and I felt the humiliation burning in my cheeks like acid. That night, as Jake held me while I cried myself to sleep, I made a decision. Dad wanted a war? He was going to get one. But first, I had to figure out how to fight an enemy who was supposed to love me unconditionally and who knew exactly where all my weaknesses were. I should have known that having the police escort Dad away from our apartment would only make him angrier. What I didn't expect was how far he'd be willing to go to punish me for standing up to him. Over the next few weeks, his attacks became more sophisticated, more targeted, and infinitely more cruel. It was like he'd been studying me my entire life, learning exactly how to hurt me in ways that would leave the deepest scars. The most vicious blow came through my military connections, which should have been sacred ground. Somehow, Dad had managed to track down contact information for my former commanding officers and several members of my old unit. He spent hours on the phone with them, spinning elaborate tales about my deteriorating mental health and erratic behavior since leaving the service. According to his version of events, I was having severe adjustment problems, showing signs of aggression and instability, and potentially dangerous to myself and others. Captain Rodriguez, who had been my CO and someone I deeply respected, actually called me personally to express his concerns. "Mitchell," he said using my military surname, "I got some troubling calls about you this week. Your father seems genuinely worried about your psychological state." He mentioned some incidents that sound serious. "Is there anything you need to talk about? Any support you need from the VA?" Having to explain to my former commanding officer that my own father was lying about me to try to extort money was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. Captain Rodriguez was understanding once I explained the situation, but I could hear the confusion in his voice. In his world, family members didn't wage psychological warfare against each other. The very fact that I had to defend my sanity to someone whose respect I valued so highly felt like another piece of my soul being carved away. But Dad wasn't finished with his character assassination campaign. The next betrayal came from someone even closer to home. My cousin Danny, who I'd helped through a nasty drug addiction 2 years earlier, started showing up at family gatherings with suspiciously detailed information about my wedding plans and personal life. At first, I thought he was just being friendly, asking about dress shopping and honeymoon destinations. It took me weeks to realize that every casual conversation we had was being reported back to Dad like intelligence briefings. The truth came out by accident when I mentioned to Danny that we'd changed our reception venue due to Dad's harassment of the original caterer. 3 days later, Dad showed up at the new venue with Brenda, claiming to be the father of the bride and demanding to see our contracts. When I called Danny to ask how Dad could have known about the venue change, there was a long pause before he admitted what he'd been doing. "He's paying me, Sam," Danny said quietly. $500 for each piece of useful information. "I'm sorry, but I need the money. Rehab left me broke, and I can't find steady work with my record." "Your dad made it seem like he was just worried about you, like he wanted to help with the wedding planning. I didn't know he was trying to sabotage things." The betrayal cut deep because I'd trusted Danny completely. I'd lent him money during his recovery, helped him find housing, even written character references for his job applications. To discover that he'd been selling information about me to fund whatever he was doing with that $500 felt like being stabbed by my own brother. But more than that, it made me realize how carefully Dad had orchestrated this entire campaign. He wasn't just lashing out in anger, he was executing a detailed plan to destroy my life piece by piece. The harassment of our wedding vendors had also escalated far beyond simple phone calls. Dad had somehow obtained copies of our contracts with various vendors and was threatening them with fake legal action for conspiracy to defraud him out of his parental rights. He'd created official-looking letterhead claiming to represent something called the Mitchell Family Legal Foundation and was sending formal-sounding cease and desist letters to anyone involved with our wedding. Our poor wedding planner, Rebecca, was getting multiple calls and letters every week. "Mr. Mitchell is claiming that you're planning this wedding without proper parental consent," she told me during what should have been a fun cake tasting appointment. "He's threatening to sue me personally for helping to alienate you from your family. I've never dealt with anything like this before. I'm starting to think I might need to hire a lawyer just to protect myself." The fake legal threats were scary enough, but Dad's next move was pure evil. He and Brenda had created multiple fake social media accounts and were using them to spread rumors about Jake and me throughout our local community. They posted in neighborhood groups claiming that our relationship was abusive, that Jake was controlling me and turning me against my family. They shared made-up stories about domestic violence incidents and suggested that concerned neighbors should call the police if they heard arguing from our apartment. The posts were carefully crafted to sound concerned rather than malicious, but the damage they caused was very real. Our neighbors started looking at us suspiciously when we came and went. The apartment complex office received several anonymous complaints about noise and disturbances that never actually happened. Even the grocery store clerk where we regularly shopped asked me quietly if I was safe at home and handed me a card for a domestic violence hotline. Jake was devastated by the false accusations, especially since he'd grown up in an abusive household and had sworn never to be like his father. "They're trying to make me into a monster," he said one evening after we'd spent hours documenting all the fake social media posts for potential legal action. "Your dad knows exactly what buttons to push. He's not just attacking you anymore, Sam. He's attacking us, our relationship, everything we're trying to build together." But Dad saved his cruelest move for last. He contacted our venue coordinator with a detailed plan to crash our wedding reception uninvited. He didn't make it a threat, he presented it as a reasonable request for a father who was being unfairly excluded from his daughter's special day. He explained that he and his family would be showing up whether they were invited or not, and that things would go much more smoothly for everyone if the venue just accepted their presence. "We'll only cause a scene if we have to," Brenda had apparently told the coordinator during one of these calls. "All we want is for Robert to be acknowledged as the father of the bride and for Sam to show some basic respect for her family. If she can't do that willingly, then we'll have to make our point more publicly." The coordinator was terrified and called me immediately, but the damage was done. Dad had effectively turned our wedding day into a hostage situation where my choice was to pay his ransom or watch him destroy our celebration. That night, I had my second major panic attack in as many weeks. The walls felt like they were closing in around me, and I couldn't catch my breath no matter how hard I tried. Jake found me hyperventilating in our bathroom, convinced that my heart was going to burst out of my chest. As he held me and helped me breathe slowly, I whispered the words I'd been thinking for weeks: "Maybe we should just elope. Maybe we should take whatever money we have and just disappear somewhere he can't find us." The idea was tempting in a way that scared me. Dad was winning. His campaign of psychological warfare was working exactly as intended. He was turning what should have been the happiest time of my life into a nightmare, and I was starting to think that giving up might be easier than continuing to fight. But Jake looked me in the eyes and said something that changed everything: "Sam, if we run now, he wins forever. Not just this battle, but every battle you'll ever fight. We need to find another way." He was right, but I had no idea what that other way could be. Dad held all the cards, knew all my weaknesses, and seemed willing to go to any length to get what he wanted. How do you fight someone who's supposed to love you but is treating you like an enemy? How do you win a war against your own family? The answer to how to fight my father came from an unexpected source. Rebecca, our wedding planner, had been dealing with Dad's harassment for weeks and was getting increasingly frustrated with the whole situation. During one of our meetings, she mentioned that her brother-in-law was a retired military attorney who specialized in family law and harassment cases. "I know this is getting out of hand," she said, "and I think you need professional help to deal with it. Would you be willing to talk to someone who actually understands legal options?" That conversation led to the most devastating week of this entire ordeal, but also to the beginning of my salvation. The lawyer, a kind woman named Maria Santos who had served in the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, listened to our story with the calm professionalism of someone who had seen every type of family dysfunction imaginable. But even she seemed shocked by the scope and maliciousness of Dad's campaign. "What your father is doing goes far beyond normal family disagreements," she explained during our consultation. "This is systematic harassment, financial fraud, defamation, and potentially criminal stalking. The theft of your college fund alone gives us grounds for serious legal action." Hearing a legal professional validate that Dad's behavior was actually criminal, not just mean, felt like someone had finally thrown me a lifeline. But before we could take any legal action, Dad launched what can only be described as his nuclear option. Using the college fund theft as leverage, he filed a completely fabricated police report claiming that I had stolen family heirlooms from his house, specifically my mother's jewelry. According to his version of events, I had broken into his house while he and Brenda were away and taken items that didn't belong to me. The jewelry in question was a pearl necklace and matching earrings that Mom had worn on her wedding day and had specifically left to me in her will. I'd taken them from Dad's house 2 years ago when I moved into my own apartment, with his full knowledge and permission. But somehow, he'd convinced the police that these were family heirlooms that belonged to the estate, not personal gifts to me. Getting arrested 1 week before my wedding was surreal in the worst possible way. The officers were apologetic but firm, explaining that they had to investigate any claim of theft, especially when it involved valuable items. I spent 6 hours in a holding cell while Jake frantically called lawyers and tried to gather documentation proving that the jewelry was legitimately mine. The local newspaper even ran a small item about it: local woman arrested for theft of family jewelry. The timing was perfect from Dad's perspective and devastating from mine. Every vendor, every guest, every person involved with our wedding saw that story. Even though the charges were dropped within 48 hours once we provided Mom's will and other documentation, the damage to my reputation was severe. Dad had successfully made me look like a criminal in the eyes of our entire community. But the arrest was just the setup for his real masterstroke. While I was dealing with the legal fallout and trying to salvage what was left of my reputation, Dad was working on the most brutal betrayal yet. He'd been pressuring my grandmother Rose, his mother, to choose sides in this conflict. Rose was 83 years old and had essentially raised me after Mom died, stepping in to provide the maternal love and support that Dad was incapable of giving. Grandmother Rose had been the one constant source of unconditional love in my life since Mom's death. She taught me to cook, helped me through heartbreaks, and was the first person I called when Jake proposed. She was supposed to be sitting in the front row at our wedding, wearing the corsage I'd specially ordered in her favorite shade of purple. Losing her support would be like losing Mom all over again. The phone call came 3 days before the wedding. "Sam, darling," Grandmother Rose said in her shaky voice, "I need to talk to you about this terrible situation with your father. He's been so upset, crying every time he comes to see me. He says you're trying to cut him out of your life completely, that you've been influenced by people who don't understand family loyalty." I could hear Brenda's voice coaching her in the background, telling her what to say. Dad had dragged his elderly mother into this mess, using her age and confusion to manipulate her into taking his side. "I can't be caught in the middle of this anymore," Grandmother Rose continued, and I could hear the tears in her voice. "I love you, Sam, but Robert is my son. Family has to come first. I think it would be best if I don't come to the wedding after all." The sound of the phone hitting the floor echoed through our apartment as I collapsed to my knees, sobbing. Jake found me there 20 minutes later, still clutching the phone, completely broken. Grandmother Rose had been my anchor, my connection to Mom, my proof that family could be loving and supportive. Dad had taken that away from me too, and he'd used an elderly woman's love for her son to do it. That night was the darkest point of this entire ordeal. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling completely defeated. Dad had systematically destroyed my relationships with every family member, attacked my reputation, sabotaged my wedding, and now turned the one person I thought was untouchable against me. I felt like I was drowning in an ocean of betrayal with no shore in sight. But sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Jake had been making phone calls all evening, and around midnight, our doorbell rang. Standing in our hallway was Sergeant Major Williams, Jake's former commanding officer, still in his dress uniform despite the late hour. Behind him were 2 other Marines I recognized from Jake's unit, also in dress blues. "We heard you were having some family trouble, Mitchell," Sergeant Major Williams said in his commanding voice that somehow managed to be both stern and gentle. "Marines don't leave their own behind, and we certainly don't let bullies attack our family. Jake filled us in on the situation, and we're here to offer our services." What happened next still gives me chills to think about. Sergeant Major Williams sat down at our kitchen table and listened to the entire story from beginning to end, asking pointed questions and taking notes like he was planning a military operation. And in a way, I guess he was. When I finished talking, he looked at me with the same paternal pride I'd never seen in my own father's eyes. "Sam," he said seriously, "your biological father has declared war on his own daughter. But he made one critical mistake. He forgot that Marines take care of their own, and you've got 50 brothers and sisters who are about to remind him what real family looks like." What followed was the most incredible display of military precision and family loyalty I'd ever witnessed. Within 24 hours of that midnight meeting, Sergeant Major Williams had mobilized what he called Operation Wedding Shield, a comprehensive plan involving active and retired Marines from both my unit and Jake's. These weren't just casual acquaintances offering to help. These were battle-tested veterans who had served together, bled together, and understood the true meaning of having each other's backs. The first phase involved gathering intelligence and documentation. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had worked in military intelligence, spent an entire day helping us compile evidence of Dad's harassment campaign. We printed out every threatening text message, every fake social media post, every witness statement from vendors who'd been harassed. By the time we were finished, we had a file 3 inches thick documenting every attack Dad had made against us. "Your father thinks he's fighting a civilian," Maria explained as she organized the evidence into a coherent timeline. "He doesn't understand that he's actually declared war on the United States Marine Corps. We protect our own, and we don't lose." Meanwhile, Rebecca's lawyer friend had been busy as well. The evidence we'd compiled was more than enough to prove that Dad had committed multiple crimes, including theft of the college fund, filing a false police report, harassment, and defamation. We now had the option to press serious charges that could result in jail time for Dad and Brenda. But more importantly, we had legal grounds for a comprehensive restraining order that would keep them away from our wedding entirely. The second phase involved community outreach and reputation rehabilitation. Several Marine veterans in our area had connections with local media, business owners, and community leaders. They quietly spread the word about what had really been happening, countering Dad's narrative with facts and character references. The owner of the local newspaper even agreed to run a small correction, noting that the charges against me had been dropped due to false allegations. But the most powerful moment came when Captain Rodriguez, my former commanding officer, called Dad directly. I wasn't there for that conversation, but Jake told me later that it lasted about 15 minutes and left Dad visibly shaken. Whatever Captain Rodriguez said during that call, Dad's attempts to spread lies about my military service stopped immediately and permanently. The third phase was pure emotional healing. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being without any agenda or price tag attached. Sergeant Major Williams and his wife insisted on hosting a pre-wedding dinner for us at their house, where 20 Marines and their families gathered to celebrate our upcoming marriage. These people barely knew me personally, but they treated me like beloved family because that's what Marines do for each other. During that dinner, I finally understood what Jake meant when he talked about military family. These weren't just people he'd worked with, they were brothers and sisters who had chosen each other through shared hardship and mutual respect. And now, by extension, I was part of that family too. The contrast with my biological family's treatment couldn't have been more stark. Brenda, meanwhile, was starting to show cracks in her alliance with Dad. The legal threats we documented made her realize that she could face serious consequences for her role in the harassment campaign. She'd apparently assumed that family conflicts were somehow exempt from normal laws, and discovering that she could actually go to jail for helping Dad stalk and harass us was a wake-up call she hadn't expected. She called me 3 days before the wedding, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely scared rather than manipulative. "Sam," she said quietly, "I think maybe this has all gotten out of hand. I never meant for things to go this far. I was just trying to support my husband, but some of the things Robert has been doing, they're not right. I want you to know that I'm not going to be part of this anymore." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the first acknowledgement from anyone in Dad's camp that his behavior was wrong. Brenda's withdrawal of support left Dad increasingly isolated, and from what we heard through family channels, he was becoming more erratic and desperate as his allies abandoned him. The final phase of Operation Wedding Shield was the most impressive: actual wedding day security and support. Every aspect of our celebration was now protected by a network of Marines who had volunteered their time and expertise to ensure that nothing could go wrong. The venue had been quietly scouted for security vulnerabilities. Backup plans had been developed for every possible disruption Dad might attempt. Even our vendors felt more confident knowing that trained military personnel would be present to handle any problems. But perhaps most importantly, I had a new father figure to walk me down the aisle. When Sergeant Major Williams offered to take that role, I cried for 10 straight minutes. This man, who had known me for less than a week, was willing to stand in for my biological father and give me away with the dignity and love that every bride deserves. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. I was walking away from a toxic family of blood and toward a chosen family of love. The night before the wedding, Jake and I sat in our apartment surrounded by wedding gifts from Marines we'd never even met, cards from veterans across the country who had heard our story, and flowers from local business owners who wanted to show their support. The apartment that had felt like a fortress under siege just days earlier now felt like a command center for the most important mission of our lives. "Are you ready for this?" Jake asked as we went through the final checklist one more time. But I realized that the question wasn't really about the wedding logistics. He was asking if I was ready to officially leave my old family behind and embrace this new one we'd found together. I looked around at all the evidence of love and support surrounding us, thought about the 50 Marines who would be standing guard over our happiness the next day, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I told him, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I meant it completely. Dad had tried to destroy my wedding and my happiness, but instead, he'd helped me discover what real family actually looks like. Tomorrow, I would walk down that aisle surrounded by people who had chosen to love and protect me, not because they had to, but because that's what real family does for each other. The morning of my wedding dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect October day that feels like a blessing from above. I woke up in the bridal suite at our venue, surrounded by my Marine family who had insisted on staying close to provide protection and support. For the first time in months, I felt truly peaceful, knowing that every detail had been planned and every possible threat had been anticipated. But Dad wasn't ready to surrender without one final battle. At 9 in the morning, just 4 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, he showed up at the hotel with Brenda and Kevin in tow, demanding to see me. The hotel staff, who had been briefed about our security situation, politely explained that I was not receiving visitors. Dad's response was to raise his voice and demand his parental rights to see his daughter on her wedding day. "I don't care what kind of restraining order she thinks she has," Dad shouted in the lobby, loud enough for other guests to hear. "I'm her father, and I have every right to be here. This is my daughter's wedding, and I'll be damned if I'm going to be excluded by some jumped-up military bullies who don't understand family values." 2 Marines in dress blue uniforms materialized in the lobby as if they'd been waiting for exactly this moment. They didn't say a word to Dad, didn't threaten or posture. They simply positioned themselves between him and the elevators, their presence making it clear that he would not be going upstairs. The contrast between their quiet dignity and Dad's increasingly frantic shouting was impossible to miss. Staff Sergeant Chin, one of Jake's closest friends from his unit, approached Dad with the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "Sir," he said politely, "I'm going to need you to lower your voice. You're disturbing other hotel guests, and the bride has made it clear that she doesn't wish to see you today. I suggest you leave voluntarily before this becomes a more serious problem." Dad's face turned purple with rage. "Who the hell do you think you are, telling me what to do? This is my daughter's wedding, and I'll see her whether she likes it or not. You have no authority here." But as he said this, he noticed that more Marines had quietly appeared in the lobby, all in dress blues, all maintaining perfect military bearing. The silent message was clear: he was outnumbered and outclassed. Meanwhile, upstairs in the bridal suite, I was trying to focus on getting ready despite the commotion I could hear echoing from the lobby below. My maid of honor, Rebecca, the wedding planner who had become one of my closest friends throughout this ordeal, was doing an amazing job of keeping me calm and focused on the positive aspects of the day. "Your dress looks absolutely stunning," she said as she helped me with the final touches to my hair and makeup. "Jake is going to fall over when he sees you walking down that aisle. And wait until you see what the Marines have planned for your processional. It's going to be the most beautiful thing you've ever experienced." But the peace of that moment was shattered when Brenda somehow managed to slip away from Dad and Kevin and make it to our floor. She pounded on the bridal suite door, her voice carrying a desperate edge that I'd never heard before. "Sam, please, just let me talk to you for 5 minutes. I know we can work this out. Your father is sorry about everything that's happened. He just wants to be part of your special day." Through the closed door, I could hear the lies and manipulation in her voice, but there was something else there too: genuine fear. She knew that Dad had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, and she was terrified of the consequences that were coming for both of them. But whatever sympathy I might have felt for her was overshadowed by months of harassment and betrayal. "Brenda," I called through the door, my voice steady and calm, "you had your chance to be part of this family, and you chose to stand by while your husband tried to destroy the most important day of my life. You don't get to show up now and pretend that everything can be fixed with an apology. Please leave, or I'll have security escort you out." The silence that followed my words lasted about 30 seconds before Brenda started crying. Not the fake tears she'd used during her manipulation campaigns, but real, ugly sobs of someone who finally understood that her actions had consequences. "I'm sorry," she whispered through the door. "I'm so sorry, Sam. I never meant for it to go this far. Your father, he's not the man I thought I married. I'm leaving him after today. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." It was the first genuine emotion I'd heard from Brenda in 2 years, and despite everything she'd done, I felt a moment of pity for her. She'd tied herself to Dad's sinking ship, and now she was finally realizing how far underwater they both were. But my pity didn't extend to forgiveness, not today. Today was about moving forward with my new family, not looking backward at the wreckage of the old one. Downstairs, the situation was escalating despite the Marines' professional restraint. Dad had apparently decided that if he couldn't get to me, he would make sure everyone at the hotel knew exactly what he thought about the situation. He was ranting to anyone who would listen about ungrateful children, military brainwashing, and the breakdown of traditional family values. "This is what happens when you let your daughter join the military," he announced to the horrified lobby full of wedding guests and hotel patrons. "They turn them against their own families. My Sam used to be a sweet, obedient girl who respected her father. Now she's been brainwashed by these military thugs who think they can intimidate honest Americans." What Dad didn't realize was that many of the people in that lobby were Marine families who had come to support our wedding. His rant about military brainwashing was not going over well with people who had served their country with honor and distinction. The mood in the room was turning decidedly hostile, and Dad was too caught up in his own outrage to notice that he was making enemies of everyone around him. The final straw came when Dad made the critical mistake of trying to push past Staff Sergeant Chin to get to the elevators. The moment he put his hands on a Marine in dress blues, the situation changed from a family dispute to something much more serious. Chen didn't retaliate with violence, but he did what Marines are trained to do. He controlled the situation with minimal force and maximum effectiveness. "Sir," Chin said in a voice that could cut steel, "you have now committed assault on a member of the United States Marine Corps. You have 5 seconds to remove yourself from this hotel, or I will call the police and have you arrested for assault, trespassing, and disturbing the peace. Your choice." The lobby fell completely silent. Even Dad seemed to realize that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The Marines hadn't raised their voices or made any threats, but their presence communicated something that Dad's civilian mind finally understood: he was no longer dealing with family drama. He was now dealing with people who had sworn an oath to defend each other, and he had just attacked one of their brothers. Hotel security, who had been watching this entire scene unfold, stepped forward to escort Dad, Brenda, and Kevin out of the building. As they were led toward the exit, Dad turned back for one final attempt at psychological warfare. "This isn't over, Sam," he shouted toward the ceiling, knowing I could probably hear him. "You'll regret this for the rest of your life. You're destroying your own family." But his words had no power anymore. I was surrounded by my real family now, people who had chosen to love and protect me not because they had to, but because that's what family actually means. Dad could shout all he wanted from the parking lot, but he was no longer part of my story. He had written himself out of it with his own choices, and I was finally free to write the next chapter without him. As I put on my mother's pearl necklace and prepared to walk downstairs to marry the love of my life, I felt a sense of closure that I'd never expected to achieve. The little girl who had spent years hoping for her father's love was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that love isn't something you can demand or purchase. It's something you earn through your actions, and Dad had proven beyond any doubt that he was incapable of earning it. The war was over, and I had won by refusing to fight on his terms. Now it was time to celebrate victory with the family that had actually shown up when I needed them most. Walking down the aisle of my wedding should have been one of the most nerve-wracking moments of my life, but instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. As I stood at the back of the ceremony space, my arm linked with Sergeant Major Williams, who looked absolutely dignified in his dress blue uniform, I looked out at a scene that took my breath away. 50 Marines in full dress blues stood at attention along both sides of the aisle, creating a pathway of honor that led directly to Jake, who was waiting for me at the altar with tears in his eyes and the biggest smile I'd ever seen. The sight of all those Marines, some who had never even met me before this week, standing guard over my happiness was one of the most moving things I'd ever experienced. These weren't just wedding decorations. They were my brothers and sisters, my chosen family, my protectors and witnesses. "Ready, daughter?" Sergeant Major Williams asked quietly, and the word daughter spoken with such genuine warmth nearly broke me down right there. This man, who had known me for less than a week, was treating me with more paternal love than my biological father had shown in years. I squeezed his arm and nodded, unable to speak around the emotion clogging my throat. As we began our walk down the aisle, I felt the power of being surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being. Every face I looked at reflected back love, support, and joy for Jake and me. These people weren't here out of obligation or family duty, they were here because they wanted to celebrate love conquering adversity. The contrast with the toxic family drama we'd been dealing with for months couldn't have been more stark. About halfway down the aisle, I heard a commotion from the back of the venue. Dad had somehow managed to get past hotel security and was trying to force his way into our ceremony. "Stop this wedding," he shouted, his voice carrying clearly over the music. "I'm the father of the bride, and I demand my rights. This ceremony is invalid without parental consent." But something amazing happened. Instead of panic or disruption, the Marines simply shifted into formation. Without any apparent signal or communication, they closed ranks behind us, creating a human wall between Dad and the ceremony. They didn't turn around, didn't break their attention posture, didn't acknowledge the disruption at all. They simply made it clear that Dad would not be passing through their ranks to disrupt our wedding. Venue security quickly moved to escort Dad out again, but the damage he'd hoped to cause never materialized. Our guests barely seemed to notice the disturbance because it was handled so professionally and quickly. The ceremony continued without missing a beat, protected by people who understood that some things are sacred and worth defending. When Sergeant Major Williams placed my hand in Jake's at the altar, he leaned in close and whispered something that I'll never forget. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, and any man who can't see that doesn't deserve the honor of calling you daughter." Then he stepped back and saluted us both, a gesture that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. The ceremony itself was perfect in every way that mattered. Our officiant, a retired Navy chaplain who was a friend of Sergeant Major Williams, spoke beautifully about the bonds that tie us to our chosen family and the courage it takes to leave behind relationships that no longer serve us. When Jake and I exchanged vows, we weren't just promising to love each other, we were promising to create a new kind of family based on respect, support, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The moment that will stay with me forever came right after we were pronounced husband and wife. As Jake and I kissed for the first time as a married couple, the 50 Marines raised their swords in a traditional arch above our heads. Walking back down the aisle under that canopy of crossed blades, with my new husband's hand in mine and the sound of genuine celebration all around us, I felt like I was walking into a completely new life. During the reception, the love and support surrounding us was overwhelming in the best possible way. Marines who had never met me before that week came up to congratulate us and share stories about Jake's service that made me love him even more. Local business owners who had heard about our situation sent gifts and best wishes. Even people who didn't know us personally but had heard about Dad's behavior stopped by to offer their support and tell us how proud they were that we hadn't let bullies win. Rebecca, our wedding planner who had become such a dear friend throughout this ordeal, gave a toast that brought the entire room to tears. "Most weddings are about two people starting a new life together," she said, raising her glass. "But this wedding is about something more powerful than that. It's about the triumph of chosen family over biological obligation, of love over manipulation, of courage over fear. Sam and Jake, you've shown all of us what it means to fight for what's right, even when the people who should support you are the ones trying to tear you down." The traditional sword ceremony that followed dinner was the most emotional moment of the entire day. As Jake and I walked through the arch of raised Marine swords, each Marine offered a personal blessing or piece of advice. Staff Sergeant Chin, who had dealt with Dad's tantrum that morning, simply said, "Semper Fi, sister. Welcome to the family." Staff Sergeant Gonzalez, who had helped us document Dad's harassment, whispered, "You're stronger than you know, and you're never alone again." But it was Sergeant Major Williams who delivered the words that summarized everything. "Sam, you came to us as a daughter in distress, and you're leaving as a daughter loved. The uniform doesn't make the Marine, the character does. And you, my dear, have more character than most people ever dream of having." Later that evening, as the reception was winding down, I learned that Dad had made one final attempt to disrupt our celebration. He'd shown up in the parking lot with Brenda and Kevin, apparently planning to confront guests as they left the venue. But several of the younger Marines had anticipated this possibility and were quietly stationed outside. When Dad approached the first group of departing guests, he found himself face to face with Marines in dress blues who politely but firmly suggested he leave the premises. The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes and involved no violence whatsoever, but it finally drove home to Dad that he was completely outmatched. These weren't civilians he could intimidate with threats and manipulation. These were trained military personnel who had dealt with real enemies in real conflicts, and they weren't impressed by his amateur psychological warfare tactics. As Jake and I drove away from our reception toward our honeymoon destination, I looked back at the venue where 50 Marines were still helping with cleanup and making sure every guest got safely to their cars. These people, who had welcomed me into their family without hesitation, were still taking care of us even after the formal celebration was over. "How do you feel, Mrs. Thompson?" Jake asked as we pulled onto the highway, using my new married name for the first time. I thought about the question seriously, taking inventory of my emotions after the most intense few months of my life. I felt relieved, certainly. I felt grateful beyond words. But most of all, I felt free. "I feel like I finally understand what family is supposed to feel like," I told him, and I meant every word. Dad had tried to destroy our wedding, but instead, he'd helped me discover what real love and support actually look like. The family I'd been born into had failed me, but the family I'd chosen had saved me in every way that mattered. As we drove toward our new life together, surrounded by the love and protection of our Marine family, I realized that Dad's final defeat wasn't being escorted out of the parking lot by military personnel. His final defeat was the fact that his daughter was driving away toward happiness that he would never be able to touch or taint again. Our honeymoon in Hawaii was the first time in months that I could truly relax without constantly looking over my shoulder for the next attack from Dad. Jake and I spent 2 weeks on the beach, hiking through tropical forests, and talking through all the trauma and healing that needed to happen after everything we'd been through. It was during those quiet conversations that I finally began to understand the full scope of what had happened to us and what it meant for our future. The first phone call we made when we returned home was to Maria Santos, the military attorney who had helped us navigate the legal aspects of Dad's harassment campaign. She had good news. Dad had formally dropped all of his complaints and threats, apparently on the advice of his own lawyer who had finally explained to him exactly how much trouble he could face if we decided to press charges for everything he'd done. Your father's attorney made it very clear to him that he was looking at potential jail time for the theft of your college fund, filing false police reports, harassment, and stalking, Maria explained during our meeting. He's agreed to a comprehensive settlement that includes repaying the stolen money with interest, a permanent restraining order, and a written apology. More importantly, he's agreed to have no contact with either of you for a minimum of 5 years. The written apology, when it arrived a week later, was clearly crafted by Dad's lawyer rather than coming from any genuine remorse on his part. It was full of legal language about misunderstandings and communication breakdowns, but it contained no real acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused or the relationships he'd destroyed. I read it once and then threw it away. I didn't need his fake apology to move forward with my life. What surprised me most was how quickly the community rallied around us once Dad's behavior became public knowledge. Local business owners who had been influenced by his lies started reaching out to apologize and set the record straight. The newspaper ran a feature story about our wedding that focused on the beautiful display of military support and community resilience. Even people who didn't know us personally but had heard about the situation sent cards and letters expressing their admiration for how we'd handled everything. The most meaningful response came from other families who were dealing with similar situations. Over the next few months, I received dozens of messages from people whose own relatives were using weddings, graduations, or other major life events as opportunities for manipulation and control. Many of these people had felt trapped because they believed that family bonds meant accepting any behavior, no matter how toxic. Your story gave me the courage to stand up to my own manipulative mother, one woman wrote. I realized that I don't owe anyone a relationship just because we share DNA. Thank you for showing me that it's okay to choose happiness over obligation. Reading these messages made me understand that our ordeal had served a purpose beyond just our own healing. By refusing to give in to Dad's demands, we'd provided an example for others who were facing similar battles. 6 months after our wedding, I was promoted to senior marketing manager at my firm, partly because my boss was impressed by the grace and professionalism I'd shown during such a difficult personal situation. My reputation, which Dad had tried so hard to destroy, was actually stronger than ever because people had witnessed how I'd handled adversity with dignity rather than stooping to his level of petty manipulation. Jake and I also made the decision to start seeing a family counselor who specialized in helping couples heal from toxic family relationships. Dr. Patricia Hoffman helped us understand the long-term psychological effects of Dad's campaign and gave us tools for building healthy boundaries in all our relationships. Most importantly, she helped me work through the grief of losing the father I'd always hoped Dad could become. It's normal to mourn the loss of the relationship you wanted to have, Dr. Hoffman explained during one of our sessions. You're not just grieving the end of contact with your father, you're grieving the death of your childhood fantasy that he might someday become the parent you deserved. That's a real loss, and it's okay to feel sad about it. The healing process wasn't always smooth or linear. There were days when I felt angry all over again about the years of manipulation I'd endured without recognizing it for what it was. There were nights when I woke up from nightmares about Dad showing up at our apartment or finding new ways to sabotage our happiness. But Jake was patient and supportive through all of it, and our Marine family continued to check in on us regularly to make sure we were doing okay. One of the most surprising developments came from Brenda, who followed through on her promise to leave Dad. She filed for divorce 3 months after our wedding and moved back to her home state with Kevin. Before she left, she asked to meet with me one final time. I almost said no, but Jake convinced me that I might regret not hearing what she had to say. "I want you to know that I never understood what Robert was really doing until it was too late," she said during our brief coffee meeting. "I thought I was supporting my husband through a difficult time with his ungrateful daughter. I didn't realize I was helping him wage psychological war against someone who had never done anything wrong except refuse to be extorted." She paused and looked directly at me. "You were right to stand up to him, Sam. I should have stood up to him too, instead of enabling his behavior. I'm sorry it took me so long to see the truth. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, and I didn't invite her to stay in touch, but it did provide some closure." Brenda's acknowledgement of what had really happened validated my experience in a way that felt important for my healing process. She had been there for all of it, and her confirmation that Dad's behavior was genuinely abusive helped me trust my own perceptions about what I'd experienced. The most beautiful part of our new life was watching our chosen family continue to grow and strengthen. Sergeant Major Williams and his wife became like parents to both Jake and me, hosting us for holidays and major celebrations. Rebecca remained one of my closest friends, and we eventually started a small business together helping other couples plan weddings while dealing with difficult family situations. 2 years after our wedding, Jake and I made the decision to start our own family. When our daughter Lily was born, she was surrounded by more honorary aunts and uncles than we could count. The Marines who had protected our wedding day became the people who taught her about honor, courage, and loyalty. Sergeant Major Williams was the first person besides medical staff to hold her, and the photo of him in his dress blues cradling our newborn daughter is one of my most treasured possessions. Most importantly, Jake and I have been very intentional about breaking the cycle of emotional manipulation and conditional love that I grew up with. Our children will never question whether they're loved, and they'll never have to earn affection through compliance or payment. We've already started teaching Lily, even at her young age, about the difference between healthy relationships and toxic ones. The $10,000 that Dad demanded for walking me down the aisle seems laughably small now compared to the priceless gift of discovering who my real family truly is. His greed and manipulation cost him his relationship with his daughter, and eventually cost him his marriage, his reputation, and his standing in the community. Meanwhile, his attempts to destroy my wedding led me to a deeper understanding of love, loyalty, and what it means to truly belong somewhere. I learned that family isn't about blood or obligation, it's about love, respect, and support freely given and gratefully received. I learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, it's finding the courage to walk away from people who never deserved you in the first place. And I learned that when you stand up for what's right, even when it's scary and difficult, you'll often discover that you're not as alone as you thought you were. Today, as I watch our daughter play with her honorary Marine uncles and aunts, I feel nothing but gratitude for the path that led us here. Dad tried to teach me that love was transactional, that family relationships were about power and control, that I should accept mistreatment because of biological connections. Instead, he accidentally taught me the opposite, that real love is unconditional, that healthy families support each other's happiness, and that the bonds we choose can be stronger than the ones we're born with. So to anyone out there dealing with family members who are trying to manipulate or control you, especially around major life events, I want you to know that you have choices. You don't have to accept mistreatment because someone shares your DNA. You don't have to pay emotional ransom to people who should love you unconditionally. And you don't have to face these battles alone. There are people out there who will stand with you, protect you, and love you the way family is supposed to. Sometimes the most important thing a parent can teach their child is what not to do, and in that sense, Dad was actually an excellent teacher. The question is, what kind of family are you going to choose to build with the lessons you've learned? For Jake and me, the answer is clear. We're going to build the kind of family that our Marine brothers and sisters showed us is possible, one based on honor, loyalty, and love that never comes with a price tag attached. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to set boundaries with toxic family members, even during important celebrations? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about overcoming family drama and finding your chosen family. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve better than manipulation and emotional extortion. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and remember that you have the power to choose love over fear, respect over control, and chosen family over biological obligation. Here's to all the Marines, chosen families, and anyone who stands up for what's right when it matters most.